Good morning. So I'm going to give you a quick wrap-up of this course, World Cultures Asia. You notice, of course, I added an interpretation to the title. This is really, of course, an interpretation, right? As you know, this is not a straight spoon-fed packet of information, that you would just take away, right? What we're doing here, and the whole point of this is to go through interpretive process of understanding what we mean by Asia, right? So where are we at when you think about it? To start, we talked about how this course is not a straight history course, right? And the reason why, and this is not to beat up on history, by the way. And nowadays, of course, we have loads of very good within the discipline of the study of history. We do have critical perspectives, but the whole point was to emphasize that we do not take historical events for granted, and we do not take particularly the messaging of these events, right? The reconstruction and the description of these events for granted. So it is certainly beyond counting and labeling. It is not a history course in that we take an anthropological approach. It is holistic, and what we're seeing and what we have seen are layered, right? With layered meanings. They're multiplex. And we take both the historical diachronic perspectives, and we look at patterns, right, and synthesis, and we look at the synchronic relations, the lateral relations of things around the world, things in Asia, of events and actions, and the whole time, right? What I have emphasized, I believe, particularly in the discussion, is that we be reflexive, right? What is it that we bring to the table? What is it that we bring to the discussion? What are our assumptions? And how are these new things that we're learning, right? These new relationships that we're learning, how are these changing, right? And forcing a revision of our assumptions and, and what we used to know, right? And how can we advance our knowledge through this? So Asia as a continent, right? Everybody kind of knew that. Your fifth grader would know that. Oh, Asia is a continent, right? What is it even, how is it even a continent, right? And why is it that our conception of Asia is so much centered in China? So that's, the first question that we posed. Again, right? It is about how do we know what we know, right? Perspective of relationships as opposed to identities, as opposed to preset particularly, and in this age, and here in America, the first thing that, that hits me when I, came to this country and already I was an adult, right, is that, in all of the forms that you fill out, the official forms, from the moment you come into this country, applying to come into this country, right, you need to declare, some sort of a fixed identity, and it had to be one because it is a checklist, right? It's not even given to description. So that is how wooden, how flattened it is, right? That we see people, especially people who are not us, who are not our friends, who are not anybody we're familiar with, that we have dinner with. We see them in terms of a particular label, right? So major and minor religions, right? One of the earliest, our earliest take on Asia, right? Is looking at some of the religions that you may be familiar with. We think of it as world religions. Oh yeah, sure. Asia is Buddhist, right? So we know about that, and minor religions and how they're different. And you notice that there's the perspective of subscribers to religions, right? And again, if you grew up in the middle of this country, and if everybody, went to church, if everybody was Christian, nobody was so rude as to even ask, right? So that's what my intention is, to pull you out of that, right? To let you see that, okay, Christianity has its characteristics, right? Just as Islam has its characteristics, and in fact, the two are actually, they share many similarities, right? For one thing, they're monotheistic. They're very outward-looking, right? They're religions that believe that they're the only right way, okay? And then compared to the lesser-known religions, but from the Western perspective, right? And how is, with all of that, as you see, Hinduism being, polytheistic, that is Jainism, and those are interrelationships. You see Sikhism, right? And you see Buddhism. And you see how Buddhism was incorporated even to the older tradition of Taoism and Confucianism, right? Which, of course, in the West, we learn to discard that as, oh, no, that's not religion, we didn't, have scriptures. It's just the teachings of the teacher. Hey, wait a minute, but isn't Jesus also a teacher? So that's how, in fact, the rest of the world, many also other religions in Africa and in different parts of the world that we're not naming here, are lesser known, and why, for what reason, right? And then when you think about it, how it is that in many ways, right, the study of religion forces us to see that, in fact, capitalism, right, is and evolves as, in our post-modernity into a form of religion too. Right, so that's something to that I will leave you with. There's references, some of these references I'd like to, highlight them for you. Andre Pickney on Hinduism and Huang on Confucianism. And if you have time, right, in the summer, just for the fun of it, right, now that you've gained these perspectives, look up, something simplistic like Bellamy's introduction to world religions, and then you see how that kind of information is controlled, sanitized, and very much, right, from a Eurocentric perspective, of, the whole lineup, of how we normally would present, the world, right, our overview, our Western overview of the world, right? So pitfall of Western objectivity is certainly an undercurrent in this course, and in fact, it is a problematic that I try to address directly, right? In one way or another, when we look at culture and society, right? Why do we, how do we distinguish the two, right? How is it that we're taught to kind of define these things, like once you find one statement to make, what is culture? Culture is, and then we assume that we know it all, right? And what is the difference between trying to define something and trying to fill it? It's sort of like, okay, if you're trying to make sense of a dish, delicious stew or something, right, or stir fry, and you're kind of trying to say, hey, where is this coming from? And it's so delicious, I'm enjoying it. So can we describe that, right, and unpack, the elements that form these things, right, instead of treating it from a distance as an entity, right, or a system, with the structures that we just take care of by drawing lines around it. So Hinduism, right, it gives us very good material, for looking at the layering of meaning and the building of traditions, because it's so much time and it's complex. When you see people practicing Buddhism, right, it's awesome. There's so many things in there, very pluralistic, right, and at the same time, right, you see how with the Western perspective coming in through colonialism, in many ways it gets is rigidified by again that outside perspective, and also the outside perspective because people get colonized, right? They then see that the Western perspective is more legitimate, so they start to then talk the language of the Western observer, and and it becomes sanitized and simplified. So Confucianism, the same thing. You ask an average Chinese person, oh, Confucianism, oh yeah, it's a set of teachings. That's all there is, right? Dualistic notions of heavens, the universal spirit, the earthly Shen and the Xian and the ancestors. And then when you look at that official, we are clean philosophy. No, Chinese people are so advanced, and we're not superstitious, right? So we want to be as much like Christians as possible. So we don't talk about those things, right? We leave those things at home for the grandparents. But then again, right? Folk practices. How are folk practices sustained? Right, in spite of all of these, plastic notions, how human beings are supposed to be, right? Now we're all Westerners, we all go to McDonald's, right? We don't do any of those things. So again, right, think about that, right? I hope, this enriches your perspective. So culture, we think of it, culture is culture, religion is religion, right? So, but then again, of course, right, religion is very much at the heart of culture, when you think about it. Like I said, right nowadays, right, our cultural being, it's so predominantly, we're a consumer. Right? It makes you feel so good. Go on Amazon, pick up a few packages, But is that religion? Yes, that is in some ways, a kind of a religious experience that you have, So thought systems, religious systems, and how those underpinnings are there, you can describe it, but then they change, accordingly, right? Society, right? Again, we see that society is not equal to an ethnic group, right? Society forms itself. There are complex societies, there are relatively simple societies, and it is a continuum, okay? And normally when we talk about society, we think of it in terms of vertical relations, right? We think in terms of government, officials in charge, right? We think about those relationships, with power at play, Whereas when we talk about communities, we normally, and even now, when you look in the newspapers, when we say community, we mean, the poor Asian community, they're being attacked, with so much Asian hate, right? So why? Because of the powerlessness, right? Because of the marginality, of that community. But then again, positively, there's more cooperative relationships in community, right? There's more nourishing, culture, that is in community. Whereas society, yes, power relations at play, and then you see yourself as, climbing the social ladder, but then, there's a great deal of alienation and frustration. So the more complex a society, of course, the more you have, suicides and, loneliness, drug abuse, substance abuse and so on. Continuity and change, right? Things and entities, right? Once you see them as not codified, right? They tend to be codified, right? Because if you only rely on textbooks and newspapers, right? Then you see them in terms of precepts, laws, and scriptures. You see as, somebody breaking a norm, Of course we can shoot him, because, he walked into my, my front yard and, and that's our private property. So that's how we see things, right? But then, as we look at relationships and events, right, in this course, and you see how, right, people, it is agency, it is people at the ground level, and the real sufferings that are brought to bear, and sympathies that are brought to bear that push for revision and innovation and change, okay? So all of those things, are what we try to cover in looking at Asia. With that, culture diffusion, right? Culture diffusion, right? Even through just religions, you see how Hinduism goes into Buddhism, right? So that the roots of Hinduism, right, are played out in Buddhism because Gautama himself, right, as the modern memory, official founder of Buddhism. And by the way, right, Buddhism in the legend and the tradition of Buddhism, actually Buddhism predates Gautama, right? But of course, that is not much known to non-practicing and certainly people outside of Asia, right? So, with that, and then you see the intermingling of Confucianism and Taoism as well, right? So that's how it is. And through language, you see the same. Shifting boundaries, right? We talked about boundaries, and again, we started with, okay, if you look at the map, you see boundaries. That's how maps are. The maps are constructed in order for you to feel really comfortable that you can overview big places, in the whole world, by drawing boundaries. And as you know very well, as we struggle with our own democracy, right, how boundaries actually are constructs that are changeable, right? Boundaries are about power. Boundaries are about relationships. Boundaries are about, do we want our neighbors, to come in, and do we want to build relationships? And so to that extent, of course, boundaries are fluid things, right? So how much are boundaries guarded by the overvoice of the media? Right, in naming and labeling, right? Whose perspective, is perpetuated, whose perspective is decimated, and denied, with this play with boundaries, right? And we look at the state, the state is the standard one that we don't question. But here we try to question it by going ground level. You look at the consumer, you look at the agency, you look at subjugated people who don't get a voice, right? Then you see that, okay, those are the constructs, that are controlled by the ones that are in power, or the consumer, that is driving the marketplace. So a feisty newsreel about the Chinese New Year in the Philippines, right, gives us a lot, to think about, right? How in the first place, what motivates a newsroom like that, and how is this played out, these Chinese people, praying in the Philippines, on the Chinese New Year Eve, and all that complexity, right, really is kind of showing you another side, that is unofficial, really, about the Philippines. The Taoist trance ceremonies, that I got you to watch, from Singapore, the same thing, right? You can think about how, that sense that, okay, for this to be legitimate, right, this is in some ways maybe sponsored, somebody has driven, this kind of media exposure, of Chinese folk traditions. But then, those things, those are very, very charged, religious moments, as you see with trance, right? Normally, only participants, people who care and people who subscribe would be there. But here we're observing this, like, oh, let's turn this into something kind of interesting, right? So what gets translated and what doesn't, right? So that's the question, and what is the role of the self, the voice, that gets the microphone, right? That gets, represented. What's that role in, what is the role of censorship, in that voice, or self-censorship? So there are references that some of these readings that are relevant, to how we are seeing, something like Buddhism, right? We think of Buddhism as meditative, but then Buddhism is also very much at the heart of, this sort of Taoist practice, right? You see how people deal with contradictions, right? In the Asian traditions, that's the one thing, right? That for a lot of Asians, you ask the average Asian person, if you sit down and talk beyond small talk, right? You would see that their perspective on the West, right, is that Westerners tend to be very binary in their thinking, that it has to be right or wrong, right? One way or the other, things have to be resolved. If you have a problem, talk it out, right? Talk it out and resolve it. But actually, these sorts of, religious traditions, as you see through this course, right, actually, make for a different sort of social practice, and that even today, right, is played out differently. When you have a conflict, generally, Asians kind of, they work through, sort of is half meditative and half social drama, and, and you don't necessarily resolve it, you acknowledge it, and you kind of smooth it out over time. That's one way. Not that it necessarily has to be right or wrong, right? So, and then it fundamentally, right, you see that, Buddhism, right, deals with an everyday contradiction of how do you be human, which is very material and organic, that you're kind of in the earth, right? But at the same time, you must aspire to detach yourself from it, right? So that material attachment, detachment, tension is always there, reminding, the human being, right, of the complexities of life, right? So that's the fundamental thing, and of course, Asians are very materialistic and very into brand name goods, and celebrity and all of this stuff, and yet, right, there's this other aspect to it. Asian material culture and movement, we look at that more directly, historically, of silk and spice and ships, right, of conquest, right, of extracting of resources by the West, so from the pre-modern to early contact with the West, the Silk Road, we address that, we address the age of Chinese imperialism, right, the idea of empire, and then the Japanese, right, breaking out of its isolation into its own sort of Western Asian model, of empire. So, economics of Western contact, it's a complex thing, but it starts, of course, you see the difference between how the Dutch and the English approach that, and then through history, right, and how they come off, at the end of the Second World War, and what it is now, what does it mean now to be Dutch or English, right? That's something that we tend not, again, to address, especially not in terms of Asia, right? Because, what it is that, again, right, is that Western tendency to kind of discount itself, that transcendental perspective that, oh, no, we're not involved, we're here to observe, right? We're not involved, we're just students, we're just learning this thing, right? But what are you learning this for? Right? If you're not involved, right? The only way to really learn it is to acknowledge that you're involved. You're part of it. Yeah. So, India, the making of colonial legacy, that is a big piece. Okay, in your understanding, if you care about at all, about the Anglo-American, perspective and what it means to be Anglo-American, what it means to be Anglo-Anglo, right, nowadays, and why that relationship, it's not as simple as just, we celebrate July 4th because, our earliest Puritans, right, came from England. More than that. much more than that, right? And you see the cruelty and the exploitation of India, right? And you see that, right? And of course, carrying on to how indigenous people all around the world, right, have been treated, are being treated, how they're made to disappear pretty much from Canada, right? And then you see how the French are treated differently, right, in Canada. At least, right, you have the Franco-Anglo, theoretical imaginary in Canada. And here in America, how we treat our indigenous people, right? So all of that come into the making of the Asian American. All of that baggage come into the making of that, right? Not just the fact that their ancestors come to do the railroads, and of course there's the Asian Exclusion Act and so forth, right? But it's more than that. So modernizing pressures, right? Modernizing pressures is not about, oh, do you become Western or Asian? Because you're Western, you're just lucky, you're already modern, right? It's not about that, right? Because that tension, right, between being Asian and being Western is always there. And nowadays you see a lot of buy-into from people who outside of the quote-unquote ethnic national heritage of being Asian, actually subscribing to an Asian way of life, right? You just have to travel to a big city, in China to see, Westerners completely adopting a different way of life and, learning Chinese and so on. So, the historical concept of modern, right, and nation state and how that traps us into the whole academic tradition of studying other people, right? Including what we're doing now, right? And how we have to present everything in terms of the modern nation state countries, identifiable countries. Why? Because you guys come from this public education system. I have no choice, right, but to do that. So, and partly because, we're doing it all in English, and that too, and the monolingualism of English, right, the dominance, the hegemony of the English language as a way to transmit knowledge, to articulate knowledge, that also presents, a barrier to our understanding. So East Asia is the core of what we consider modern Asia, right, but then in the triangulation of Japan and Korea, and China, you find that in many ways, right, and this is what I like to propose to you, that sometimes you might want to work your thinking through to a space where the West is not necessarily relevant or always relevant, right? And when you can get to that space, there's a way of freeing it up so that when you come back to thinking about the West, right, then you would be able to see the West in more nuanced terms, right? So Western conceptions, right? Again, more and more, directly as we come towards the end of the course, of course, and ending with now, what did you know prior, right? Is important and something we need to grapple with, right? What did you know prior that actually limits your understanding or your reception of, things that are beyond what you'd known before? So, America's Philippines, right? When you think about it, it's America's construction, right? And we talked about how, that is, it's a sort of a one-sided dynamic, of how, how Filipinos end up, with us, right? We see in the typical presentation of the Philippines and how we even know this Philippines, right? The Philippines is people who work in healthcare, So in this article, in Hawaii, Hawaii tells us, right, that in the middle of the country, right, in Louisiana, you have Tagalog, right, and you have the Manila Man, right, paving the way for other settlers to come in on the fringe. A very surprising angle, to what the Philippines mean, and the position of Filipinos in the United States. Pike's chapter, the murder of Aquino, right? That again, right, gives us, okay, we look at leaders, we look at, historical figures, in the typical history books, right? We think of them as, classifying them, oh, this one is democratic, this one was, like Mao Zedong, was the communist, dictator, and then Marcos was this corrupt, dictator of Southeast Asia. But then, when you look more closely from a sort of a more insider perspective, right, then you see, interesting aspects of, what it is about the Philippines. So Macau is the same, we touch on Macau, we can't touch on everything, but we, and the reason why I chose Macau is that, again, it has this very interesting dimension that we tend to ignore, right, which is the European presence, the early European presence of the Portuguese, right, in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And Lusophonia, as a phenomenon, right, they came with the conception of a Portuguese legacy that evolves, outside of Portugal, right? So that kind of, binds the Brazilian world, with the Chinese Macau world, right? Because of obviously Macau being on the edge, of mainland China, and you must know that historically it is China, and China puts an imperial claim on Macau, for ever so long. But today, again, very interestingly, you see how China reclaims its power and legitimacy over Macau by actually incorporating its Europeanness, right? Through tourism, and, it's always been a very successful, very big tourist attraction, and the gateway of China, as a gateway of China. And of course, very well known for its casinos. So, and then here's another reading of Post-Colonial Imaginary Politics of Representation, where, I begin to introduce to you street festivals, right, the idea of social drama. So from tradition to conscious construction, right? Conceptually, again, right? Traditions are what's given to you that you take on, but then there's also the conscious construction, that we do all the time, right? That leaders do, Okay, so the Second World War ended. So what are we going to do? Okay, there's work to do, all right? And of course, that kind of state construction, and the making of nations is all about the construction, right? Um, and here, right, like I said, in introducing drama, in introducing ground level agency, we looked at Sinhalese theater, we looked at Sri Lankan street plays, we looked at wayang kulit in Malaysia, and famous Balinese cockfighting tradition in Indonesia that's still practiced, right? And these things, by the way, are living traditions, right? They're still being practiced, and they have evolved, into our post-modernity. And what it is that I try to get you to make sense of it in terms of the idea of social drama, okay, which is sort of one area in the study of cultural anthropology, where you focus on the action and the happening, right, on folk agency, on ordinary people. Okay, and not sort of the institutional type of drama, where you pay, you buy a ticket to watch as a passive audience, right? So in this kind of social drama, participants are community members, right? Participants come together and playing out vertical relations of conflict and power, that may be just a dramatization of what they live with in the day-to-day life, right? So it's a mode of protest, right? It's an underpinnings of mass and civic engagement here, right? And sometimes for real, it is the real protest. So when you think about it, right, in the Western world, in our complex societies, we have our social dramas. Right, we have the dramas that are played out, some of it more or less institutionally in church congregations, and then others, maybe spontaneously, right, in the street, in a barbershop, somewhere, where people gather, right, people gather to work out the differences and the similarities and the solidarity, right, and certainly, right, a lot of local agency that you see, for example, in a vigil, right, when you see something terrible has happened in a community or in a protest, right, in a gathering, to make a statement. So, Victor Turner, gives us the concept of communitas and liminality, and we talked about that in a PowerPoint. And gets us symbolic interpretive anthropology. So those are some of the key theoretical perspectives that I introduced, right? The unpacking of interactive dynamic, right? And kind of building culture, making sense of culture in terms of the shared meanings, right? And in that sense, right, this is the heart of what we do in this course. And Richard, as the third perspective that I wanted to introduce to you, she represents sort of critical cultural studies, and with a very I would say a sort of a no mincing word kind of edgy critical approach to looking at unpacking ethnicity and modernity and Western hegemony, and particularly from a perspective that is othered, right? That is traditionally othered, and recentering that perspective, and also recentering translingual practices, right? As a way to push back against hegemony of the monolingual thought, right? And especially hegemony of English monolingualism. Southeast Asia in World War II and beyond, right? These are the materials we've covered. Again, right, you can interpret history as social drama as well. When you see in that one documentary, right, about the Japanese occupation, you see the multivocality of people speaking in the different voices and the different languages, right? And I'm making sense of it, based on personal memory. The cold prosperity, that messaging, from the top, right, with the Japanese, trying to get Asians, right, into this kind of more or less racialized idea, of how we're all together and we have to fight against the West, right? And then with the British return, and how Southeast Asians have to kind of reinvent themselves, right, in terms of this Western colonial legacy. Even though it was exploitative, they had to buy into it, right, because that was the global economic model, or world order, that if they had rejected it, it would have stunted their development. So but those were very fraught times, right? A lot of the small countries, they could have gone one way or the other. They could have gone with the Soviet Union, or they could have gone with the United States, right, in terms of where we're now. So the YouTube, like I said, right, the Rising Sun, very much, if you guys missed it because you were busy, please go back to it. Nationalism, language, and identity, right? Here, right, as some of you asked, and indeed, yes, right, the whole point of this course, right, is to learn about critical interpretation, right, and your textbook simplification, of nation, of nationalism, of language identity as singular, unitary equivalence, right. That's something that, if nothing else, right, that you need to break away from, that you need to have learned from this course, right. So that's why you're asked in the final written assignment to critique right? That chapter that was about the manufacturing of new nations in this very nice, happy world, of, oh, okay, the war is over, so here's Indonesia, here's Malaysia, here's, Africa, here's, let them, let's see, we all come up with precedents and with, with prime ministers modeled after the US or the UK, right? And is that simple, right? So given what you've learned through this course, of course, right, there's no other way but to critique, the textbook simplification. Multilingualism and pluralism, right, as key to our understanding of Asia. Again, I kind of tried to drum that in, especially towards this last, couple weeks. Okay, the mental block that we have, right, as Anglo-Americans or as those of us who partake, in the normative, of the Anglo-American way of seeing the world. Okay, our habit of identifying, objectifying, of using the passive voice because the language allows for it, and all of that, right, and how that actually, constitutes a mental block, for understanding the complexity of the rest of the world, and in this case, Asia. The politics of English, something that we cannot shy away from, right? It's really something very real. Because English is a very value commodity, right? English is so dominant, right? And then if you happen to inherit it, right? So English speaking monolinguals, are pretty much the only privileged group of monolinguals in the world, right? And yet we a lot of us imagine, right, the natural way to be in life, in human life, the natural way for human beings to be is to be monolingual, which is actually quite the opposite. The majority of the world populations are at least speakers of two languages, if not more, and why? Because the only way to survive, given the penetration and given the linguistic imperialism of English, is that wherever you are, right, in the modern world, particularly if you choose, if the community chooses not to isolate itself from the modern world, is by poverty and whatever, naturally isolated, have to be speaking English, right? At least, and striving to learn English, and and that is how it is, in terms of the politics of English. So a case of Hong Kong, right? Swee's article to the 2004 allows you again, right, to see the historical development, how English has come to be, what the colonial legacy behind it. And of course, and now with the predominance of Chinese as well, of Mandarin, right, as a vernacular. And we think of Chinese as being unproblematic, but I'm not going to go there today. And of course, Hong Kong being historically a Cantonese speaking place. Singapore, with English, reclaimed in globalization, right? That it has a global as well as a local identity, and how English evolves in the nurturing, of its complex identities, as multiracial and multicultural in a very small place, really physically a very small island state. If you have any time, I recommend that you watch I'm Not Stupid. Okay, if you get a chance, it is on YouTube. This is one of the earliest film productions. Is a movie, is a comedy, but it really it illustrates so much, of the reality of that part of the world that is somewhat little known in North America. So moving along, we look at Asia or Asians as embodying a mobile sense of being, right? We look at consumerism. We look at how Asia is also caught up in, of course, historically transmigration that then is expressed primarily in the 21st century, particularly as a culture, its own culture of consumerism, right? So that is taking claim, that is consuming, and placemaking that goes along with consuming. So that's now, of course, commonly a sense of Asia and Asian and all things Asian as being the most well-traveled and the most mobile, the most everywhere imaginary that we can have. And the idea of Asian markets, right, that is everywhere beyond the continent that is Asia. And in S. Butt, right, you have a very substantive article that gives you a nice overview of who migrate, why, and where, right? And this goes beyond the traditional notion of how, Asians would be forced into migration because of economics and because of instability or war at home, right? And nowadays, of course, right, migration becomes very much part of consumer culture and part of staking capital and investing in properties. For example, you have a culture of rich Hong Kongers that have set up pretty much its own little Hong Kong city in Vancouver, right? So globalization, something that we have taken for granted very much in the 21st century, and now look at what it's doing to local life, right? As you go back into Asia and see what's going on. The definition of relationship, right, of influence, and what influence is, on the flip side, and how that affects sense of rootedness, tradition, belonging, and continuity. So along with the transmigration and the mobility, of course, is the disruption, the instability, the loss, the assimilation to the West, and so on and so forth. So culture, in the meantime, I also try to take you onto the plane of, especially in terms of globalization, culture as capital, right? Culture as cultural capital, culture as commodifiable things and ideas, and culture as control. So, and from this angle, you can see that, for example, the PRC, right, is very much taking on, sort of taking back control of Chinese culture as China becomes, the superpower, an up and coming, rich and wealthy nation state. And then you see how now all of a sudden the state is more interested in culture than before, right? And then you think in terms of the cultural revolution in China and during the heyday of socialism, and how culture was de-emphasized and pretty much scrapped, and now these things are reappropriated by the state, and particularly played out in the phenomenon of the Confucius Institute, right? And this is sort of a proactive engineering of the Chinese government to take control of the consumption, the learning, the teaching of the Chinese language and culture. So there are many Confucius Institutes set up around, across the Western Hemisphere, as well as in different countries in Africa that have particularly taken investment from the Chinese government, as well as in Southeast Asia. All right, so infrastructure investment is a big one, and again, the replay of the idea of the Silk Road into what is now called the Belt and Road Initiative. And culture is real estate and mega media, right? That marriage between the two, as you see, not only playing out in Western, in traditional Western capitalist economies, but certainly playing out very much in Asia too. And really, the two not making any much of a distinction because you have cross investments across the oceans. So the residue of all of this, these 21st century geopolitical phenomena. Of course, is that there is more poverty, right? There's ever more poverty. There's protracted extreme poverty and extreme inequality in Asia, right? And so that in many ways, right, you see that any parts of the world, we take a critical perspective, you can see that pretty much, those of us who are, happen to be on the a privileged, fortunate trajectory, the growth side of capitalism and world capitalism, we kind of buy into the prosperity gospel, right? The American dream. But then the foot soldiers of that, right? Those people that are decimated and depleted, and dispossessed, right, is the same system that that keeps the system going, right? So Asian consumerism, more specifically, right? How has consumerism taken a life of its own that defines Asia in many ways and what it means to be Asian? That's a big piece there. The buying power of Asians, transcending the continent, and all of that, right? We think about it massively, how Alibaba takes over, in the same way as Google and Amazon, take over all of our consumer life, right? And because of the wherewithal of our platform economies, right? And these, right, kind of force a reconception of how we think about people and the differentiation, cultural differentiation, all that, and geography, right? And how much of it is now, making geography not part of the, not a factor, not such a key factor. So bringing this home to America, our study of Asia is also about Christianity and Western powers, as we have seen. It's about the colonial and the modern era. We've gone from pretty much the late phase of the colonial era through the modern era of the 20th century, and now we're in the postmodern era. And we still see that, of course, the continued dominance of the European American imaginary, right? And to this day. And of course, with that, we have the naming and the labeling. We have the oversimplification of the others, right? Of the West versus the rest. And there's a sense in which, here we are, right, particularly in the present of recent politics, the political climate of the United States. You can see very much that, that after all, the Eurocentric and the Anglo-Eurocentrism, centricism, of perspectives, have actually very much, right, gripped, this country, in sort of in a regressive trend, trending towards, closing in on itself. Okay, so there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of prejudice. And then that explains why it is that it now seems to be okay to have anti-Asian hate, to kick old ladies off the platform in the subway, right, to push people in broad daylight in the sidewalk, so you see a lot of that going on, right? And fundamentally there's a sense in which what America, there's a kind of a mental block, that America is seized with this thing of of its own denial, right, of its own denial of its foundation, on the very thing, right, which is racism, exploitation, slavery, right? All of that, right, founded upon the exploitation of Africans, and African slave labor, that this country is built on, that is unable to address in any way, right? And the continued denial that also leads to, that being the, the model in which it sees everything else, which tends to be, to put people in their categories, to keep a distance, and to censor, to simplify, to erase. So the problematics of Asian, in a way, right, what it is to be Asian, right, you can see the dialectics of the globalized Asian, the marginalized Asian, right. It gets still very much from the perspective of the distant observer, the Western perspective, right, and the idealized model Asian American, right, the idea of the quiet Asian who gives no trouble, would not question the structural inequalities and injustice, and then of course, and if they do, right, they're on the margins, they're hardly visible, and then at the same time, of course, we pander to the global market, we pander to, to of course to cheap imports, right, from Asia, the advantage of the cheap labor. And for centuries in the modernity, that's how we have functioned and we've operated in terms of Asia. It's a shifting in the fuzzy boundaries, that we've learned in this course, right? Now, how do these, right, get resituated, if you like, right, for us to understand what is the continent of Europe after all? What is the continent that is, the Americas, and when you think about that, right, why it is that, that there is even such a thing as an unmarked American. Right, that itself is a problematic, right, in terms of Latin America, Central America, and then here we are, we've claimed America as the USA, right, regardless of what's happening up north and down south. So where are Asians, right, and where are the Americans? Where is anyone, right, that has a label put upon them? Well, Asians could be in airplane mode just as anybody else. They could be in KL, they could be in Cleveland, Ohio, just as those who claimed, to be the unmarked American. So, very much, many of us have heard about the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's one of those things, right, that, when we talk about the history of the Chinese here, we would actually give a token nod, to the fact that such a horrible thing did happen, in the same way as, we acknowledge the Japanese internment, right? And there's a sense of which, we're past that, right? And now we've progressed into this era of diversity and inclusivity and whatnot. But then again, when you think about it, right, what has happened is there's a sense in which there's the Asian exclusion perpetuity, right? While the Chinese Exclusion Act, that was legislated might have been over, what is going on is that, Asians continue to be, again, on the margins, made invisible, not vocalized, muted. And, in Julian Lim's reconceptualization, right, I'd like you to think about how you can bring that perspective, back into looking at what's going on in America, right? The center, the idea of the center and the peripheral paradigm, and who controls the representation, right? Who are the people that are center that that takes the subject position, that are constantly in control of the media, of the representation of others. Look at the dynamic of relations between minorities, for example, right? Between, let's say, Chinese folks and Mexican folks, in New York City, who work as food delivery people, or who work in Amazon, right? Delivering your packages, right? These are the people that may form their own dynamic, and in making Asia and Asian, right? Ultimately, it's possible, right? And making other minority spaces, Latino spaces, as actually social spaces that, that are transformative, that, that may not actually, need that framework of, of the West to make, to be made sense of, right? So ultimately, learning about Asia is also about, kind of pushing the boundaries of your own familiar framework, and grappling with your own othering, right? So, seeing yourself as perhaps, possibly the other, for a change, right? And then, and looking back inwards, on how we can, change these perspectives. Okay, expectations and takeaways from this course. I believe you have learned and interpreted facts and figures of place, context, and patterns, right? That you have practiced critical analytical thinking and synthesizing around events, peoples, and places, of organizations, systems of thought, traditions, looking at continuity and, of course, looking at change. And, and in many ways, particularly in the discussion, you have brought to bear personal experiences, you have explored your personal empowerment, right? That the relevance of that, of these perspectives in the everyday life, right, of your own experience, as well as, the present day of where we are now in the time and place of the US, and possibly, packing these away as extra added value to your own outlook as global citizens, right? So now we end with cliched impressions of Asia. Okay, just three pictures that I thought, are particularly poignant in thinking about Asia. So here is, of course, the familiar image of Buddha. And, those of you who recently went to a Japanese restaurant or, some fairly high-end Thai restaurant, or, you may have seen something like this, right? So it's almost very much our day-to-day experience now of such images. And indeed, right, it's very multivocal. An image like this, as cliched as it is, the image of Buddha very much represents the certain tenor of what it means, right, to be Asian, what it means to be Asia. There is the fact that it is such an enduring tradition, the tradition of Buddhism, and its influence, at the same time as it evokes Hinduism, right? Some of the oldest philosophical traditions are right there, and there's a sense in which, compared to the West, particularly, the Buddha and Buddhism captures the a certain restraint in the in the sensibility of Asia and Asian, that perhaps maybe a distinguishing quality, right? And which is why I thought the word endurance may be suited to thinking about that. And then here's another picture that I thought I'd share with you, right? You may not recognize this, but this is the little bit of water, that separates North Korea from South Korea. In many ways, right? For parts of Asia, China included, and Japan included, obviously. There's always this sense of you're on the edge, of home, but there's also a home beyond that home. Okay, and the longing, to me, the longing, the suffering, between South and North Koreans, very much actually encapsulates, that Asianness, that idea of, hope and transcendence, the idea that, you're always kind of longing for something better, your reunion with people, with more Asians out there, with your friends, your relatives, right? And then, at the same time, right, sometimes you're put in a position where you have to transcend, you have to transcend the pain and the suffering, in order to go on, So you have this guy, he's just doing his job, he's standing on the edge and he's looking over to make sure, in spite of his pain, to make sure, right, that the other side can't come over. That is his job, right? And then finally, right, on a lighter note, here is a shuttlecock, right? Some people call it the shuttle, for the badminton game, right? Because cock sounds, rude. But this is it, right? It is one of the, it's stereotypically, a very popular sport, right? And popular not in the backyard sense in America, right? But a serious popular sport that is lesser known in the West, and the West thinks of it as a joke, right? Why would Asians take badminton so seriously, right? But it is in badminton, right? It's when you see the shuttle, in the air, it's the beauty of it, and to me anyway, personally, right, it represents the vitality and the adaptability of Asia, because the shuttlecock has actually gone through many different transformation throughout, and the game too actually has changed somewhat through time. So there we are. Here is World Culture Asia. Thank you very much.